So because of that, we are going to have a survey. Thanks to that fellow who never showed up and who will fail the class, you will be able to take the survey sometime. I don't know when, I'll check. And I'll give you 5 minutes. I'm supposed to give you 5 minutes at the end of the class. So what we're going to talk about today, just going to make sure we're yes. And I've got that up in a taller leg, so hopefully that'll get a little bit better angle on that. I'm slowly learning how to use technology. I'm going to talk about labor markets today, and I'm going to talk about the background of labor markets, kind of give a sense of what determines wage, but also the perceptions, and how perceptions are very important. The perceptions of skills, and the perceptions of skills that that employers want to say they want to look for, and that potential employees, people that are going into the job market, say that they have, and for people like yourselves that may not have been in the labor force before, what you'll want to think is well, when you go for your first to look for your first job when you graduate, what is that going? What is it that a potential employer is looking at? And so we're going to think about that. What is a potential employer looking at? And because you don't have experience, so they have some information about you, and their information is you going to university. So it's essentially, where does the value of a university degree come from? We're also going to look at more detail on the labor market. I was able to, quite recently, we've had recent releases of data from the 2015 census. So I was able to, which wasn't available when I had this class last year, but I've been able to update that. So I've updated that on the structure of the labor market, and we can see how the labor market, who's in the labor market, what are some of the issues related to the labor market, and now I have to get started. The issues related to the labor market, and especially the status and impact that women in the labor force have, and how the importance of increasing the availability of women to work in the labor force, how important that is for the Japanese economy. So we're going to be talking about that. I don't know if we're going to get to all of that today, but we will do our best to get as far as we can. And we are talking about labor markets and households supplying labor to firms. And we're going to review some of the important concepts today relating to how labor is valued from the perspective of the firm, and how the firm chooses the size of its labor force. We've talked to some degree about that, but now we're going to focus on that. I'm going to talk a little bit about excess demand and excess supply as it relates to labor markets, and that has to do with determining the wage rate. The idea that there's a distribution of potential marginal product of labor across the labor force. In other words, that one of the things we've talked about so far in this class is we've assumed that all households are the same. When we've done our analysis, we've assumed that all households are the same, and that is that everyone has the same skill level. But in fact, people have different skill levels. So people have different skill levels, and what we're going to do is we're going to show how we can think about how can we think about how that is. So then we're going to introduce a model of the labor market that extends the assumptions we made earlier for a perfectly competitive market, and to consider how the labor force functions in a world that is not perfectly well. Consider how it would function in a perfectly competitive market. And to understand what we're really assuming. We want to understand what we're really assuming, and then to relax that and compare outcomes that take place in real labor markets with the outcome in a perfectly competitive labor market model. So it's a basic introduction to that, and as part of that, I have just want to introduce some definitions, brief definitions here, and the first is human capital, and that's the human capital is a stock of knowledge, skills, talent, capabilities that human beings possess. Inherited skills and talent, that's what we inherit from our parents. We have a certain intellectual capabilities, but we've developed that, and we've turned our inherited skills and talent and knowledge, and the skills and talent are acquired through education, training, and experience. So we acquire those in life. Education is the formal schooling, including primary, secondary, and university education, as well as vocational training. So we're talking about that kind of education. And training is education related to the teaching and acquisition of skills directly applicable for use by firms, which you don't get a lot here. You don't get a lot here, but I would like to, I think that at least a class like this, I hope that there is something that you can, that you're actually learning that some way has a direct impact on your work in the labor force. So this certainly has a little bit of a training aspect, but certainly I approach that my teaching with that in mind, that you are going to be or that you're interested in some type of analysis. Now other definitions. Excess demand. Excess demand means the condition where there is more demand than the market is willing to supply. So for some price, there's more. The market is not willing to supply more demand at that price. There's too much demand. Excess supply is the opposite. The condition where there's more supply than the market is willing to demand at a given price. Now, obviously, when you have those situations, you have a condition that is a disequilibrium. It's not a market in equilibrium. It's a market that is going to change. Either the excess demand or supply are going to go away, or the price that's associated with that excess demand or supply is going to adjust. Either the supply and demand adjust, or the price adjusts, or both. Wage stickiness is something that is a term that is used a lot in labor, when we talk about labor market, and that's the propensity for wages to adjust slowly to changes in supply and demand for labor. The reason is that say you're working in a job and the market changes. The market can change right away, but people, it's not that the market, the demand for something went up 2% yesterday, and so therefore you adjust your wages accordingly. Or if it goes down, that you fire 2% of your staff and then hire them back next week. You don't do that. It takes time. It takes time to fire people. It takes time to hire people. You have to think about, and those things cause labor markets. The movement in labor markets in respond to changes in demand and supply. Wages do not adjust quickly. Now, if you're talking about like the demand for carrots or for example, let's say you go to the grocery store. I go to the grocery store almost every day in my neighborhood because I don't shop at Aeon anymore. We were talking about Aeon earlier. I shop at a discount place, and so because of that, so the nature of my shopping has changed because the store's incentives are different. So I've responded to that. But part of that is that because I go every day, now I see how the prices of certain like vegetables change every day. The price of broccoli, for example, changes. If there's a supply of broccoli that comes in from some place, and there's a supply, well, broccoli that you can't sit around very long. It goes bad quickly. It's not fresh for very long, and the price adjusts. Will drop 30-40% or go up 34%, 30-40% in a day or two. you know, up and down, it's very volatile. That doesn't happen in labor markets. You can't just get rid of and hire people in that way. The only place that you can do that would be the day labor. Day labor, you might be able to do it because but you still would have to have a pretty good idea what your demand and supply are. So let's do a little bit of review. We noted last semester the marginal revenue product of labor tells us the value each additional worker provides to the firm. And we noted that firms maximize profits by setting the marginal revenue product of labor equal to the wage rate. So on the margin, firms hire to the point where the revenue product of the last worker hired equals the wage rate. So that's the profit maximizing firm acts in that way. And that's the important thing to remember is that's true for firms with market power as well for firms operating in perfectly competitive labor markets. But, however, what we're going to show is that it's possible for firms to pay their workers less than their marginal revenue product of labor. And so we're going to show, in fact, how you can model that. That happens in a situation of monopsony. And in such a case, the firm is exploiting its workers and keeping a portion of their marginal revenue product for themselves. And that is the case that if a firm faces, and what we'll see here is that if a firm faces an upward sloping supply curve of labor, then they can adjust their demand for labor and have market power on the labor side. So now I want to talk about, as I say, we've assumed that all workers in the economy are equal. Every worker has the same amount of human capital. We've assumed all households are exactly equal. They all go out. Since they're all the same, the firms look at them and say, well, you're all the same, so we pay the same wage because you're all the same, and I'm a price taker. If I'm a price taker, I can't raise. I can't reduce. If I reduce the wages I attract, I'll lose all of my workers. And if I raise wages, it won't be any benefit. So I'm going to have to pay exactly the marginal revenue product of labor. And so that's based. So one of the things we've done is assume that every worker has the same amount of human capital. In the real world, though, workers have different levels. And this is a possible distribution of marginal products of labor across households. We can think of maybe the distribution of intelligence, the distribution of ambition, whatever you want to do. There are people that are above average, and there are people that are below average. Even though everybody thinks, although everyone thinks that they're above average, the reality is that if you are average, half of the population is below you and half are above you. So if we have a situation like that says that we have, and this is some kind of what you call a normal distribution, some type of distribution that peaks and then declines around some mean, and it's fairly symmetric around a mean. That's a very common thing that we do, and that seems to be the case for things like intelligence. That's probably, there's a lot of people in the middle that are average, a few people that are exceptional, and as you get really exceptional, it gets smaller and smaller, and the same thing at the other end. And you could call this low marginal product, average marginal product, and high marginal product, and moving towards the right, increasing marginal product. So the thing we want to think about as well, if the wage depends upon the marginal product, and some people have a higher marginal product than others, then it would make sense that they have a higher wage. So that's they can offer more to a firm, so the firm would have to pay more to get that person. So the thing we're going to look at here is the kind of, it's basically like a tug of war between the firms and the individuals, because this marginal product, if the marginal products are different, then the question is how does the worker present their true marginal product, and how does the firm perceive the correct marginal product in the worker? So that is the issue. But before we do that, let's just deal quickly with the concepts of excess supply and excess demand. Here is a concept of excess demand. At a certain, if the wage rate is here, the firm at this wage, if the wage, let's say the wage is here, let's say that you've had a shift, maybe the amount of demand has shifted. Let's say you've had some outward shift in demand. Demand has increased, but the wage hasn't responded yet. So what this is a situation where say it went through here. Let's say you had the demand curve went through this point, and it was in equilibrium, but then suddenly it shifts outward. Well, the wage doesn't adjust immediately, and when that happens, you have excess demand. At this wage, now there's excess demand for workers. The market wants this much labor, but at that wage, they're only willing to supply this. The market needs more labor. Well, they have to slowly start raising the wage rates. So as you slowly move up here, you raise the wage rate. Well, then the workers are going to respond and supply more labor. That's what the supply curve says. Supply curve says the workers will supply. The more labor will come into that market as the wages rise, and so this is a condition of disequilibrium that over time will equilibrate until you get to a higher wage, and that's the condition of excess demand. And the converse of that is excess supply. Here is a situation where at some point, let's say we had a demand curve excuse me, that went through there, demand curve that went right through, say, somewhere like that, and then suddenly shifts to the left. That means demand has fallen for every price of labor, but wages don't adjust immediately. They don't adjust immediately, and so the wages are going to have to. There has to be a cutback. The firms are going to cut back supply. The response is always going to be on the supply side. On the supply side, on the demand, increasing the wage, and here on the supply side, decreasing the supply. Decreasing the way, getting rid of workers and the wage. The wages decrease. But the point here is that there's excess supply of labor. It doesn't adjust immediately. It takes time. And so that's why we can see in markets, and particularly in the case of labor markets, where you have you can have a lot of disequilibrium positions. Anyway, now we're going to talk about what is it. We've talked a lot about perfect competition. We spent much of last semester doing that, but we didn't specifically apply it to the labor market. So now we're going to take these and say, what does that mean in terms of, we talked a little bit about it, but not what it really means. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. And we're going to assume these input side labor market, perfectly competitive conditions. This is one of the things, the perfectly competitive model assumes. Essentially assumes about workers, is that they operate in perfect competition while input markets, including labor markets, as well as labor market, perfect information regarding workers' potential marginal product of labor. In a perfectly competitive market, you have to have perfect information about their potential marginal product of labor. So that's workers are transparent regarding their existing level of human capital of firms potentially interested in hiring them. The firms can look and say, I know exactly what you have. That's what you have. That's what I want. Perfect information regarding all requirements for a given position from the firm's side. The firms tell the market exactly what they're looking for, and they're really looking for that, for those things in workers. Then the above two conditions Number 4 is they produce the condition where workers and firms are perfectly matched at that skill level and the resulting wage level, providing the workers with their maximum utility and the firm with maximum profits. So under that situation, I have a certain level of skill. I go to a worker, I go to a firm, and they can look at me and they know exactly what I have. I know exactly what they want to offer. The wage that they offer me and the skills that I offer, the wage that I want to, am willing to accept, if it matches, it's because that's the best I can do, and it's the best situation. They're getting, each side is getting exactly what they want. So so the assumption is that there's a kind of fairness in the market, and that workers are fair to their employers, and employers are fair to their employees. Now we know in reality is much different, so that's where we want to think about, well, how does it differ, and what is the impact of that? So the search for a new job on the part of a worker and the search for a new employee on the part of the firm is costless. Now the only place where you can imagine that might be is in the real world is when workers show up for day jobs. You know, there's a day job market out there. In the day job, you show up in the morning, and they're looking for a certain kind of labor. Typically a certain kind of labor for a certain kind of a short-term period, and they have a certain skill, and these are people that have that skill, and they supply that. But for the most part, that's not reality. Here's a very important assumption. First, do not discriminate their hire of new employees, and they make use of their employees' maximum potential marginal product of labor the workers willing to supply to the firm. That means that the employers look and they say, you know, I don't care what country they're from, or what the color of their skin is, none of that, you know, whether they're male or female, none of that. I'm just, you know, all I'm interested in is their marginal product. Well, the world doesn't work that way. And the most important thing is they pay under perfect competition, the workers are going to be paid the marginal product of labor. So under perfect competition, they're going to be paid that. So now what we're going to do is look and see what happens when those are violated. And let's then see. Let me just. So the assumption of perfect information, it's a crucial assumption, and how it's violated makes an important part of the analysis of the labor market. When you go out in the labor market for the first, if you've never been out in the labor force holding down a job, a real full-time job before, they'll ask you to give you a resume. You either type or write some stuff in, you stick your picture on, and you know, there's the standard kind of thing that you have in this country. Well, an employer look at that and say, oh, okay, you don't have any experience. Well, how on earth do they, how do they evaluate the human capital of a new college graduate? How do you evaluate the capital of a new college graduate? Well, one way firms do this is to value the university a new college graduate job applicant attended. Each university has a reputation. Now, so they have a reputation. And it may come from the firm's actual experience with graduates from a university, or it may come from a general reputation the university may have in an industry. This university is going to have a certain reputation in the market. So if you go out into the market, they're going to make they're going to categorize your potential marginal revenue product of labor based on that you went to this university. If you go to another university, students at another university are likely to be valued differently. As everyone knows, if you go to a Todai, or a KO, they're probably going to look at you differently. In the US, it would be if you go to an Ivy League school, well, you're going to be valued differently than if you went to, if you got a degree from a four-year state university in a small town. You know, those are different. Those are perceived as being different, and that's because. So the reputation represents a signal to employers of the potential revenue, marginal revenue product. It's a signal. Now, the signal may not be correct, but it's a signal, and there's certainly if you show up in a room and then the person, and you're sitting next to somebody from a university like a Todai, the potential employer might look at you differently. Maybe when you start talking, they'll start thinking, okay, you know, that guy or that woman went to this school, but actually they make more sense than that person, you know, and they might get to know you, but that's information that's revealed, or you may try to reveal, but the first thing they're going to do is they're going to look at that signal. They look at the signal, and that's how they're going to evaluate you. But there's also other things. Everybody who graduates from a given university has the same ability. Some students study harder than other students, and those students usually earn better grades. And I can tell you that this class, there's only a handful here, but you're above average of the students of this university. I've had more average classes in the past, but I think now the kinds of students that I tend to come to my classes now tend to be more above average. So your students in general that study harder than other students. So therefore, the grades grades themselves may provide some signal if you earn a good grade. And it could, however, grades may not provide a clear indication. There's some classes here, you know, and I think this is true for all universities. There are some classes that you can get very good grades on. You probably don't have to study very hard. I'm not saying, I don't think I'm particularly hard. I'm probably not as hard as I was 2 years ago, the first time that I taught this class. Which is pretty typical for somebody that's teaching for the first time. But you probably have to study harder, and it's a bit more demanding than perhaps another class in which you can get the same grade. So you may take this class, and maybe nobody knows that, okay, you've actually had to work harder in this class, and if you get an A, or a double A or something, then you might not be able to provide a clear signal based on that. And conversely, the mediocre students who go to an easy class and get an A can cover up their that they're not hard workers, that they're not ambitious, and you know, and schools are full of people like that, you know, that probably would rather be somewhere else, but they were told they had to come to school, you know, and they wish they were someone else. My daughter tells me that. Well, she didn't go to university this year, and I don't know if or when she will. And she tells me though that many of her former classmates are telling her how much they hate going to. They're still in school. They wish they could be like her, and experiencing some life outside of it. At any rate, as I say, some classes are easy. Students learn to game the system like any, you know, students, you know, any kind of, you know, monkeys will do the same thing. You know, rats will do it, cats will do it, dogs will. Everybody, you know, every creature figures out what the system that they're operating in, and they try to figure out how they can fool. You know, do as little as possible and get as much for it. You know, so the result would be that two people with a degree from the same university may give very different qualities. And that may even be the case for two people earning degrees with similar grades from the same department in the same university. Now, I don't know, you'll have to see what are the proof of whether or not what you've learned here is any different or better or worse would be, let's say, for the people that took a similar class, but in Japanese or from another professor, whatever type of thing, and you may find, in a year or two, did it really make a difference? And I don't know, and that's difficult to tell. But the point of that is, there's the potential for confusion, and that confusion is what we call noise. It's noise in a signal. Noise is, and especially if you're not a hard worker, if you're not really willing to work hard, or actually what a lot of people do that aren't really willing to work hard is they learn how to work very hard at not working very hard, which is something I never really figured out, because to me, when I watch such people, they're making such an effort not to do anything, that why don't they just make the effort to get something done and actually accomplish something? But it's because there's noise, and there's a signal and there's noise, so at least for a while you can get away with it. You may be able to graduate and get the same job as somebody that worked harder, because nobody can really tell the difference, and it may only be later on that the difference becomes clear. And so but that's part of the challenge that an employer faces when they're dealing with that. Now, and it's a good way to think about it as the same as a signal transmitted along a communications network, say a packet of information traveling on the internet. It may be corrupted or degraded, and that may make it difficult to significantly interpret the information. The exact same concept, and it really is the same. It's like everybody's talking to their employees like this, and nobody can really understand what they're trying to say. That's noise. And so if the employer hears the same thing, it may be hard to figure out what reality is. So that's an important thing in the labor market. We really have to consider how that is. So for basically when you go out there, it's going to be the university that you went to, and it's going to be some distribution around that average. And let's say average marginal product across all students at the same university, and that's what it's going to be. That you're going to say I have a degree from Aoyama Gakuin, and here it is a single. I don't think. I'm going to have to check and make sure that's that. I don't know if that's on page 78. I'll have to check that. That shows the distribution for a single person. So that means a single person. You walk in without any information. They're going to look and they're going to think this. You may be here. You may have been a hardworking student, and maybe they're going to just see this at the when you first walk in the door. Or you could be a lazy student and be here, and they're going to see this at first. They're going to try. They want to uncover that. They want to uncover that, and what you can see is, well, if you're a firm and you've got some student that walks in that really all they have to offer is this, but they say they went to this university, so the perception is it's this. But what you really would like to do, if you want to be able to hire people and pay them this, and get rid of these people and only hire those people. But if you can't tell for sure, the problem is if you get this, that's risk. If you make the wrong hire, that's risk. And then what you have to consider is you have to consider the labor market, the laws of a particular country. And this country in particular, it can be difficult to fire people. So if you make a mistake if a firm makes a mistake and they hire somebody that turns out to not, that they thought they were here, but they ended up here, it may be costly, depending upon what the role that they play and the contract that you were hired under. It may be costly for the firm to deal with it. In fact, what happens, at least traditionally in large Japanese corporations, you'd hire a bunch of people, figure out which ones were really mattered. You started moving them up the ladder, and the other ones you stuck in the corner. They sat by the window, the window watchers. Now, I've worked in Japanese corporations, so I know. I know the window. There were the guys sitting in the corner. They were. They hired them, and they couldn't know what on earth they're going to do with them, and they can't get rid of them. And they can sometimes it's like, and depending, that's the problem. What do you do with them? And traditionally, that's the firm has taken on that as the problem. That's the tradition, is where you got to keep on paying them, so you stick them in the corner, and because they'll do the least damage, and that's what you do. That's reality. That's the reality. Companies can't really do that as much, and the large companies have less ability to do that. So let's say that we have two universities, and one has the one has better students. It attracts more ambitious students. It attracts people that on average are willing to work harder. On average, because it may be they have better teachers, or they may be more ambitious, and they may accomplish more in the environment, whatever. But as everybody knows, even in good schools, Ivy League schools, for example, in the U.S., are full of people who the only reason why they got in is because their mommy and daddies got their degree. They're called legacy. They're legacy entrants. They're called legacy because they're and a lot of those people they may be down here. So there's even the top schools have lots of people that really aren't very talented. You may have a lot of people that aren't talented. Certainly at the graduate level, of course, it would be different. But for even a school like a Harvard or Yale, Harvard. There's a lot of them are just their parents went to the school, and so they get in. They have money and they get in. So that's the problem too. Say I went to Harvard, or I went to whatever school you went to, and you say I'm this. They might be down here. And the important thing here is you can see that if you look at this distribution, this part of the distribution is actually lower than all of these people are above all of these people. In fact, these people are above. There's a certain percentage that are actually above the average from the second university. That's what this means. And then there's people here that are actually below the. There's a certain percentage from the top school that are below the average from the lower ranked school. That's what that means. That's the idea. That's represents something to reality. So the problem is that you go out in the market, and I assure you, certain companies. That's what companies do here. They hire, they're okay, you went to Todai, okay, we hire Todai people. Oh, you didn't go to Todai, well, that company hires people from that university. That makes a big, now it's not going to make a difference for the foreign companies, but the Japanese companies are probably going to be more, that hierarchy. I remember, now it's probably changed, it's probably not as rigid as it used to be, but I remember, these guys from a certain company, and that I would, in my early days in this country, I'd have lunch with them, and they were from a big Japanese firm, and they talked about how they only hired people from certain, they said, we're a second tier company, we can only hire students from those universities. They could never hire, they couldn't hire people from the Todai. And the interesting thing was the company was in trouble. The company was in financial trouble, and they couldn't hire the top talent. Everybody knew that was the second level talent, you know, so that, I think that's changed to some degree. That's probably changed to some degree, but then to some degree that's there. But as I say, with foreign companies, that's going to be less. That's the difference. The foreign companies have to be more discerning about that. But the point here is that on average, at least without any other information, you're going to tend to pay. You're going to perceive that this second university has a higher marginal revenue product of labor, so you'll tend to pay them higher. You'll tend to be more likely to hire them, and they'll tend to be more likely to hire to get paid more. And that's what people go. Why do people go to a quote unquote good school? And so basically, what we're saying here is that it's possible that let's say you're a high quality person, but you might go out in the labor force at least for a time. You know, you might not get paid as much as somebody that went to a more prestigious university, and so that's even though even if your quality is higher, that's just kind of a reality of the way that things are perceived. But the point here is that most new university graduates are not paid the marginal product of labor, the marginal revenue product. The only people that are going to be the people that are right in the middle of the distribution. And the people around it, which is the most people, are either going to be paid too little and too much. So now we want to think, well, what happens when an individual in the labor force wishes to change firms? Now, when I first came to this country, people didn't do that very much. People were they went into a company, they were going to spend their career. When I first came here, I met a lot of people that had spent their whole career in the same company. They were going to retire at that company. And that was still, for the early years that I was here, that was still the ideal. But as the economy, as we talked about how the government debt grew. Well, that was part of it, was the firms were suffering. The firms couldn't afford to pay tax. The economy was struggling. The economy wasn't working very well. A lot of firms were in a lot of financial trouble. They couldn't, but so for people that started getting more flexibility, one of the things that happened is we started getting more flexibility in the labor market. Firms were going out of business. Firms were going out of business, or they were at risk of going out of business. As soon as firms realized, one of the things that in the early 90s, as the economy slowed down and firms got into trouble, everybody thought that somebody was going to bail them out, either the government or other companies. Somebody was going to come along and bail them out. And when firms started failing, and they realized when some of the survivors realized there was no bailout, they weren't going to get bailed out. Then that started. The labor market itself started changing. So you have a more flexible labor market now. And when you go into a firm now, you're not necessarily expecting to work your whole career there. You might. It's still possible, and it's certainly more possible here than it would be in a country like myself, the country that I'm from, the United States. But it's still possible. But it's much less likely. So if you're going to change jobs, well, one of the things that's going to happen is it's like when you look for a job, just like when you go out on a date. Well, what do? You're trying to present, this an image. You want somebody to get a good impression. You don't show up. You show up with your in a suit. You got your hair done. You're wearing nice clothes. You don't show up. You don't show up like you're going out on Saturday night. You're going to try to show up and at least give that impression. And that's part of it. Is that you're hoping to. What you hope is that you get paid more than your marginal product. I mean, we all want that. You know, we hope we get paid on marginal product, but if somebody pays us more, well, who's going to complain about that? So the only way you can get that is if you project something to an employer that may not be maybe different than the reality. And we tend to go out, and again, we all think very highly of ourselves, and we go out to try to, in general, we try to go out and tell people, you know, this is who I am. Well, this might be who I really am, right here, but I'm going to focus on certain things, and I may project. That's what I want to. That's what I want to project. And so and so to our ability to and the ability of people. This would be and this could be a group of potential employees that this is their actual marginal product. This is what they present. And again, you've got it's shifted to the right. People are getting more. So if you're a firm, so the problem here, think about it. Let's say if this is the actual marginal product of labor and you pay this, that means that all of these people, but that means that all these people are actually, their marginal product of labor is below what you're paying them. A firm that does that is going to go out, could go out of business. That's the risk that the firm faces, and when you show up, let's say if you try to change companies. Now the good thing though, when you change companies, is that firms now have something to look at. So you may present this, but now they have better information to figure it out, and you know, a lot of times the people who are willing to change companies are better workers. The people that are afraid to change companies may do so because they have lower, they're not as talented. So that's also part of the dynamic of the labor market. So when they're looking, so this is what that firms, but firms do it as well. And quite often when you go out and you look at the firm requirement, they'll say they're looking for somebody with, you know, with A, B, and C skills, and you think, what is nobody? If you talk to headhunters or, you know, they're always, the firms are always asking for, they're always asking for somebody that doesn't exist, you know. They're always looking for somebody that doesn't exist. So, and why do they do that? Is it because is it because they're looking for, are they really looking for such a person? Probably not. They're not really looking for a person. They'd like to find somebody. If somebody actually has those skills, that they say that that's the person they're looking for. Now we're not talking about an average position. We're talking about, you know, a higher level position. But they may be presenting requirements as being greater than the position they'll actually require. Why would a firm do that? Why would a firm want to do that? Well, a good reason to do that is if I say you have to be this good, then the average people won't apply. So one of the things you're hoping to do is use the requirements to screen out the below average. So let's say that let's say the firm can do this. Let me see if do I have this? Yeah, here. You may say this, they're going to present this, but you're really looking for this. But if you present this, then maybe all of these people won't even apply. All these people look at it and say, well, I don't have those skills. I'm not even going to bother. So you might, you know, some portion won't even apply, and that's what you're hoping for. So think about it. You've got, on the side of the firm, are going to be presenting, they're going to present a face that says they're looking for this, and the reason is the potential employee, they're going to project more difficult requirements, and at the same time, the potential employees are going to be presenting more skills than they actually have. Now, I think people probably do that less here. In the country, in my country, people, it's ridiculous the nonsense that people talk about on their resume. The resumes are just you know, it's like, so, you know, it's like some fiction novel of their, you know, of their life. You know, and a lot of it is fiction and exaggeration. You know, so that's culturally that. I think there's less of that, but there's less of that here. But I also think what's interesting is that people are now finding out. You can find out more. I had lunch with a friend yesterday. We were talking about that. He talked about how now some guy comes looking for a job, and he says he has such and such experience, and then they do a search, and they say, oh, he was banned for, you know, he did such and such. He was banned for life from the industry, or he's doing that because it's, you know, he violated some law. They're finding a lot. Now you can find that stuff out. So people do that stuff. You used to be able to hide it. You used to be able to hide that kind of stuff. Now it's a lot harder. It's going to be harder going forward. People's lives are on Facebook, social media now. And once it gets out there, it never leaves. Maybe even if you try to take it down. Now they're trying to do some stuff in the EU to make it harder for, you know, like the searches can't bring up bad information. There's ways to get around it. People are going to find out. They're going to find out. As I say, one of the things that means is, and I've thought about, well, what is that? One of the implications of that is that it's either that really good liars are going to do better, but probably that's one possibility. Is that if you're a really good liar, you'll be able to get away with more. Or the other possibility, since people are going to find out about you, you may need to be more careful. You may need to be more careful than the average person was when I was your age. That you can do, you know, you could be doing something that could permanently affect your record, and it can have a permanent impact on how people view you. And I asked my friend, I said, well, is it possible they'd be rehabilitated? You know, and he says, well, you know, the problem is that maybe even if they've changed, the problem is that that's a risk. You'd have to take that risk, and if you're wrong, it can be very costly. So now that can permanently affect your reputation. So this is interesting, but the point here is that these are the kinds of things that go on in the labor market. So it's that, and I say we've assumed perfect information. In perfectly competitive market, we assume perfect information, and that's way not. You can see that can be depending on the job. If it's a lower level job, it's kind of probably, you know, okay, let's say it's a day job. Nobody's going to worry about what your past is. They just need your job. The guys that work at the skiji market, a lot of those guys have past that, you know, that's why they work there. The guys that work at the skiji market work there because they got guys that have all kinds of, you know, they're much more likely if workers are there to have past that they can't get jobs other places. So they're going to end up, you know, working at a place like that. You know, so because that's the kind, you know, that's the kind of, you know, that's that we've assumed that the perfect information, and the problem is that we're going to look at some other relaxing other assumptions, because if there's no noise, there may not be a bias. It may not be any systemic bias, but we can look at, we're going to relax some other assumptions and see that there may be some biases. So if we're going to relax our assumption that firms operate in perfectly competitive markets in their input and output, and now we'll consider what happens when firms have market power in their output market only. So what happened, and I think we've talked about this, that it shifts the supply curve for labor in other industries. But that's, so that has some, that certainly has some impact on it. But what we really want to talk about here is what happens when a firm has market power in its input market. What if a firm has market power in its labor input market? Now, we haven't talked about this. I've mentioned a little bit about what's called monopsony. A monopsony is a monopoly, is market power on the input market and the labor market, particularly the labor market. That is a firm with market power. Remember, the perfectly competitive firm is a price taker in the input market and faces a perfectly inelastic horizontal supply curve for its labor input. Okay. Well, this is not the case. In the firm with market power in its output market, the firm with market power in the labor input market faces an upward sloping supply curve. So it's an upward sloping supply curve. That is that the labor market is willing to supply more labor if the wage rate goes up. That's what an upward sloping supply curve means. Downward sloping demand curve means the price goes up and the willingness to pay goes down. Upward sloping supply curve means that as the wage goes up, the willingness to supply labor increases. That's what we mean by upward sloping supply curve. So if you have an upward sloping supply curve, that gives that means the firm that faces that has market power. Because if they don't have market power, then it doesn't matter. They can't affect the wage rate. If they're a price taker, then no matter how many people they hire, it doesn't affect the wage rate. Some coffee shop hires the next person they hire is not going to affect the wage rate. But if I'm the only employer in the town, or I'm the major employer, and most of the people in the city work for me, I'm a major employer, that next person I hire, I have to pay more. So I'm affecting the wage rate. Whereas a perfectly competitive market, I have no impact on the wage rate. So that's what we're dealing with here. So let's suppose the quantity of labor supplied by the market to this firm is some linear function. So the quantity is directly a function of the wage. That's a firm facing upward sloping labor supply curve. That the more labor that they, that simple expression expresses an upward sloping supply curve. Because what it says is, as the quantity of labor demanded increases, that they have to pay more. That as QL goes up, PW goes up. So the wage increases as the amount of labor demanded increases. That's an upward sloping supply curve. So what we're showing is that shows that's the marginal cost of the firm hiring each additional worker. What that means is that the marginal factor cost, or what's called MFC, the marginal factor cost, that means that the marginal cost increases. So the marginal factor increases faster than the increase in the supply curve, much like the marginal revenue curve decreases faster than the decrease in the demand curve. So it's the same concept of going in the other direction. So let's suppose, and let's take this kind of a marginal revenue product of labor curve is downward sloping. So remember, the marginal at the same time that you have an upward sloping supply curve, but on the margin there's a downward sloping, that the quality of the labor, the marginal revenue product of that labor is downward sloping. So think about it, that if you have an upward sloping supply curve, if you face an upward sloping supply curve, you're also facing a downward sloping a marginal revenue product of labor curve. Both of those happen. That has to happen. That has to happen. So let's say that we have that kind of, so as our wage goes up, our marginal product, our marginal cost of labor goes up, but our marginal revenue product of labor goes down. So remember that the firm hires labor to the point where the marginal revenue product of labor equals the marginal cost of hiring an additional worker. So for the price-taking firm, that's the point where the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the wage. But we'll see, so the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the marginal cost of labor. So we have marginal cost equals marginal product. But notice how the wage is below the marginal product. So here's a situation, and this is, now we're going to show this graphically, but you can see in this situation that the worker, that the firm, if they're maximizing profits by hiring the marginal cost, by hiring to the marginal cost of labor, to the marginal revenue product, they only have to pay for it. They don't have to pay as much. Whereas if they're going to hire to where the wage is equal to the marginal revenue product, then it's somewhere in here. But then they can't hire to where the marginal revenue product the marginal product. So here the marginal cost of labor, the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue product, but it's still here for clearly that the marginal cost of labor is greater than the marginal revenue product, but it's still, the marginal revenue product is still greater than the wage. So you can see the opportunity here is for the firm to pay a lower wage. They don't have to hire to the point where the wage equals the marginal revenue product. And that's what's going on here, is that here's the firm faces the upward sloping supply curve, because that's what a monopsonist does. They face an upward sloping supply curve. Here's the marginal cost of labor. This is it's the flip side of the marginal revenue. Here's the marginal cost. It's the marginal cost curve goes up more quickly than the supply curve. So it goes up. It goes up more quickly. So this is basically the firm's willingness to pay is the marginal cost. So they're willing to pay the marginal cost. The market supplies this, but because the firm has market power, this would be the equilibrium. The equilibrium is where the willingness to supply labor is equal to the marginal revenue product, so that the workers would be paid their marginal revenue product. That's the situation here. But the firm doesn't have to do that, because they have market power. They have market power, they can hire not this many workers, they hire this many workers, and they pay them, and they're on the supply curve here. They pay this wage, but the marginal revenue product is here, of that last worker. So marginal revenue product is greater than the wage. So they're not paying the worker the marginal revenue product. That's what happens in monopsony. And so here's an example that the firm with market power can exploit labor. This is how workers can get exploited. This is how workers are exploited. Workers are exploited whenever a firm is maximizing profits and they're facing an upward sloping supply curve. And the behavior is just, it's a natural behavior. We're saying, it's not, are they bad people? Well, they're taking advantage of the situation. They're not paying what you would think is a fair wage. This is what we would call a fair wage. And this is what we call, this is they're exploiting the situation. So this is one of the reasons why we have labor unions. This is one of the reasons why you have labor unions, is because to force workers to, because one of the things you can see, the firm makes a smaller output. So the fewer workers get hired, and they get hired at a lower wage. So from the society standpoint, that's not necessarily a good situation either. You can see that from the society standpoint. The firm is happy. The firm loves it. Great. This is what that is the effective profit they're earning in each worker, because they don't have to pay a marginal product. But from the society standpoint, fewer workers are getting employed, and they're getting paid lower wage. So that's how you get income distribution. That's in a society where this is the norm. You get a society where there's more disparity of income. That's the disparities in societies like that comes from the fact that that the firms are facing upward sloping supply curve. So that's where that comes from, and that's one of the reasons why you would say, well, that's why you need something like labor unions. A labor union can say, well, you have to pay this wage, but if you pay that wage, actually the firms that ends up hiring more. They don't hire less; they hire more. And that's the argument that you can make as a labor union, is you say, well, if you actually will hire more labor at that wage than if you have market power. You don't hire less. So that's an interesting. That's how you show in that case that's the outcome. As I say, it's and what's similar is that the firm operates at a lower level of output, charges a higher price for its output, and pays its workers a lower wage, and they pay a wage that's less than the marginal revenue product of labor at that output level. So we can see that just a firm under a market condition can produce an outcome that can be negative for the society. You can make a reasonable argument about that. Now we're going to talk about discrimination, and that's the classifying the capabilities of a group of people based on defining characteristics of the group, such as age, sex, or race, rather than considering the capabilities of individuals within that group. I can tell you that if you have any of those, I can tell you that someone like myself, at my age, it's a lot more difficult. There's a certain discrimination that I face, being the age that I am, where somebody is going to say, "Oh, well, your average person my age is thinking about retiring," and I'm thinking about what am I going to do next. I'm thinking about what's the next thing. What do I want to get done? But that's hard to, when you get classified a certain way, that makes it harder to get a position. So that's what happens for people who get older. And some people that's why they give up. Some people just give up. They give up because they can't, they can't see that's going to happen. We have 20 minutes, okay. But that's certainly something that's a discrimination. The country that I come from is pretty. The United States is pretty obsessed about race. I think the reality is there certainly is race discrimination. I think it exists, but it's probably people in my country have probably been obsessed about it, and it's certainly not as severe as in other countries. You would never know that if you're in the United States, and that may be a good or bad. There's some good aspects to that as well, but that is something that is a defining characteristic, certainly for the country that I'm from. But what I'm going to focus on here, because probably in this country, the biggest thing, although if you're as a foreigner, certainly there's probably foreigners in general are going to face more discrimination. It depends. I mean, there's someone like myself I've had a lot of opportunity because of my skill. If you have a lot of skills, you have a lot of opportunities. But probably the biggest discrimination, and probably the one that's has the biggest impact on the economy here is discrimination against women. think it's a very, very important aspect of this, and the role of women in the labor force in Japan has traditionally been restricted, and it's still to a degree restricted. But I do want to point out that things are changing, and they're changing because of necessity, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. I'm going to a little bit later. We're going to talk about the labor force, or we should be able to just start into it. But we'll be able to fully go through this data the next time and really see what's happening in the dynamics of the labor force, and are really requiring that discrimination against women it is reducing. It needs to be reduced, and just for very basic economic reasons. Now, of course, most women in the labor force in Japan work in non-executive, non-professional positions. They're employed in professional positions. They tend to be in fields such as teaching and nursing. Certainly, that was the case when I was a child in the United States, teaching and nursing. Most women who did work in the labor force were teachers and nurses. Not all women are dissatisfied with that, but I would say many women with talent and ambition are not satisfied. It's harder for women with talent and ambition, and there are some realities, and women do have to make choices that are different from the choices that men have to make. Now, I'm not going to try to decide. I'm not going to tell in any way to say, well, this is what the women's position in the labor force should be. But what we want to focus on here is the economic effects of the discrimination, and using the tools that we learned in this class. And that's what we want to focus on here. What are the effects of this discrimination to the degree that it has a negative impact on the economy? What are the things that the society needs to change in order to have a positive impact on the economy? That's the approach that I'm going to take here. So, one of our assumptions that firms do not discriminate, that firms evaluate their employees and potential hires based purely on their abilities. But now we're going to look at the effect of discrimination against women in the workplace. And there's a difference between, very likely there's a difference in the actual distribution of marginal product of labor and the perception of women's marginal product of labor in the workplace. And the degree that reflects the reality, and here's the chart, the degree that reflects the reality suggests that only the higher end, that women, and one of the things, and I certainly have perceived it throughout my career, and certainly both in the US, but especially here, women have to work harder. Women have to work harder to get to the same place as men. And the reason is that if a woman this is the perception. Here's the perception. Here's the actual. So that means that only women that are at the top end even get paid that. So only women that, and only the really talented women. And to the degree that's definitely the case. That's definitely the case. I saw. Now I did work in an industry where women are treated more fairly, and in the real estate industry, it's probably an industry among the industries there's less discrimination, because basically the job, you have to go out and make money. You have to go out and do a deal. You have to get deals done, and if you can't get the deal done, you're not, that's it. So it's not, oh, you're a nice guy, and you're going to pay you a high salary so you sit in the corner. It doesn't work in a real estate company. It's much more egalitarian. And if you can make money, you can make money, and if you can't, you're out. That's the way it works. It's more the financial industry in general. That's the financial industry in general. You can't. It's for a lot of it. It's more of what we say: you eat, but you kill. It's the you eat, but whereas in standard industries, you get paid what you get paid a salary whether you earn it or not. you know, and they deal with it. But the real estate, there's less of that. So women have been able to, they face less discrimination. They face less, I know a lot of women in the real estate industry. I worked with a lot of women, and probably in cases where I wouldn't have worked, they wouldn't have been able to get jobs in other sectors. But anyway, this is a situation that women do commonly face. What's the effect? Well, firms don't realize the level of productivity because they're qualified women that aren't put into the position of responsibility that they can get. Instead, you have men with lower levels of marginal product that are placed in such a position. But that's because they perceive that the behavior is reasonable because of the perception of quality. So that can have a cost on firms and on the society. So households with female members would tend not to maximize their household utility because they're getting paid. They may not be getting paid their marginal product. They may be getting paid less than their marginal product. So for households where the women's wage matters, which is increasingly more middle-class people, the household may be getting paid less than, in total, may be getting paid less than their marginal product. So that's certainly an issue that affects not just women, but because women are in households with men, then it can affect those households. It may be. So women would tend to choose more leisure, but leisure means a lot of different things. And one of the things that leisure means in this country means taking care of elderly, like parents. So that's one of the issues that's coming up. And we'll begin. One of the things I'm going to show you is you're beginning to see an impact on that. We're getting the demographics are now beginning to change. As I said, I talked about the effect of labor unions. I just briefly, please read that. But that if workers in such a situation, it's workers form labor unions in order to have more negotiating leverage. That's essentially the case. We could have a whole class about this. But I think the reality is labor unions really aren't that important in this country. You have labor unions, but they don't really act in the same way as they do in Western countries. So I don't spend a lot of time on that. Certainly in other countries that could be important. Minimum wage laws are designed to protect workers in low-wage industries, where it may be difficult to organize into a labor union. So that's another way, is that you protect for low-wage earners, you have minimum wage. And that's based on a weak economic status, the presence of available pools of low-skilled workers. So societies have at least a minimum wage. The minimum wage here in Tokyo, it's roughly 900 some. I don't. What is the actual minimum wage? But anyway, you're pretty much workers are paid. The minimum is about 900 to 1,000 yen an hour. That's kind of you just see the wages that are posted when you go to the store and they're trying to hire. That's kind of your minimum. That's your minimum wage. What's posted, that's the real minimum wage. At any rate, problem with minimum wage laws is that for the workers whose marginal revenue product is lower, and that's particularly either because of physical or mental handicaps or because of age, and the age could be either high or low. A lot of people what firms are doing now is they're at a certain age, they're letting them go from the firm and then hiring them back at a lower wage. I have a friend who works for a construction company, and he spent his career there. Now he's been not fired but retired you know, and then he went immediately back to work, you know, like retired and then immediately went back to work at a lower wage. But it's also, he has lower responsibility. You know, that's kind of the deal. The deal is lower responsibility. He's providing services, he's getting paid. The expectation is lower. He seems more relaxed about it. This is kind of the standard thing that large companies are doing now. And it's about 58. At age 58, they're doing that. At 58, you're getting let go, and then you retire, but you keep on working at a lower wage. So that's how they're dealing with that's what's happening there. But the problem is that, like, if you're young, maybe if you're really young, your marginal product of labor may be really low. It may be really low, and so the minimum wage laws can keep younger people from getting from getting jobs. And this is probably less of a problem in this country. I think the wage is there seem to be plenty of jobs for young people, especially once you turn 18. Once you have 18, there's plenty of. My daughter, she's 18, and she works at she teaches at Kumon. She's got a job teaching at Kumon. She works a couple days a week there, and she gets paid like a minimum wage. And then she's off too. She does modeling, and that they pay her real. She gets paid higher for that, for the modeling and stuff that she does. And so now she has other opportunities. So she's going to cut back on her. She's like, that's what you do when your marginal product is high. She has more higher marginal product, and she's good at what she does, even the teaching, but they don't want to pay her, so she's going to, that's going to go away. That's the way it is. At any rate, let me see how much. Yeah, the impact of the minimum wage is that there's fewer workers, higher wage, but fewer workers are hired. This is a really problem, I think, more in the U.S. I think it's more in the U.S. that it's a real issue. Let's see if I talk about causes of unemployment. Oh, we got 5 minutes. Probably don't have time. Okay, I'll just wrap it up here. I know people look engaged and excited about this topic. So, basically, I want to talk about the causes of unemployment. One of them is the skills required have changed so much. It's a tremendous change in requirements. And one of the things, and I've talked about how I'm looking, and I just wish I had more time to learn Python. It's because I've got some stuff. I wish I could write it. I've got some stuff I'm trying to do in Excel, and it's just, I'm trying to do some stuff where I've got to do some iterative analysis. And it's just a pain. Excel is a pain to try to, to do iteration work that would be real easy. And it'd be real easy to write the program in Python or R. And I've got, right now I've got the pressure to do this analysis, and I don't have the time to learn it in order to write the program. That's the problem. I know it, but I don't have the time because I've got to get this proposed, and I'm doing this, I got to do it now, and I got to figure out a way to do it myself. But that's the problem, is that the skills change. But I remember the first color television. And I remember when there was no color television. And we had one in 1965. And the technician came, and what they did was they had some magnetic thing that they had to wave in front of the TV to get it to set the color. It was like really, it was very, maybe maybe you had TVs like that in China. Yeah, you might have had that as a child. Those TVs, that kind of technology ended up in lesser developed countries. So,
Maybe in Japan.
yeah, and so older television, yeah. So that was the and TV technicians. There were a lot of TV technicians back when I was a kid. That was a big job. There's zero TV technicians today. Nobody's a TV technician. I mean, when your TV breaks, it goes in the garbage. You throw it out. You don't take it to get repaired. You throw it out. You know, when I was a kid, the TV broke all the time. They had repaired. It was always, the televisions were always getting repaired. There was something wrong with it. Always something wrong with the television. The tubes, we had to replace the tubes. There's something wrong with the, everything was wrong. With it. It's just, or it's, so that's, so people with the wrong skills, when the skills change, they can be unemployed. The other problem is we've had a lot of recessions. We went over that last week. The problem with recessions. I met a lot of cab drivers that had real jobs. I've had a lot of conversations over the years. I don't take cabs like I used to, but back in the days when I took cabs all the time, I had a conversation with the cab, and sometimes well-educated, worked at major companies, and now they're driving cab. They because of the last 20 years, those people lost their jobs, and there were no jobs for those people. So that a lot of those people ended up driving cab. So that's the change in the market. Let's see. I'm going to just introduce this. As I say, the labor market is getting tight, though. And one of the things we're now going to see, and we're going to spend the next class spending more time. This is what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to use the data from the 2015 Census of Population. I think some of this has just come out. Some of this has just come out, and we're going to talk about that next time. I'm going to close here. But I was able to update this, and it really shows the huge changes going on in the labor market. It's huge changes are happening. It's changing monthly. By every year, the shifts that are happening. It's like as soon as you talk about this, it's changing right before our eyes. Dramatic changes are taking place, and it's going to have a tremendous impact on you as you work in the labor force in this country, or even if you were, for example, go back to China. China is the same situation, aging population. It's suddenly going to hit really big. It's been in the making longer here, but it's going to suddenly happen in China as well. People moving out of the labor force, and you can see the numbers now. You'll see the difference in the 5 years. It changes, and it's happening right now. Yeah. So that'll be interesting. I think you'll find that we'll have a lot of pretty graphs. Here, all these graphs. You have all this, but we'll be going through this. But we're going to be able to talk about both 2010 and 2015 and see the changes that are going on in the labor market right before our eyes. And I guess I'll close here. I'm waiting for that bell, but there it is. Thanks, and let's see. We have next week is the last week before the break. That's week 13. So we're going to have 3 weeks of fun of various kinds. I'm joking about myself.
Christmas vacation.
Yeah.
Christmas, you.
Are you? Where? Well.